Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Ryan and welcome to the Manhattan Terminal Railroad. We're on the west side of Manhattan in the mid-1960s. This is an HO scale urban switching layout with two inspirations. One is the New York Central Railroad and its operation on the west side of Manhattan, the West Side Freight Line, and in particular the High Line, which ran south of 30th Street Yard. It was an elevated freight line. And then New York Terminal Railroads, which received cars only by car float, and there was about 3 dozen of those in New York Harbor. The layout is a shelf layout. It's 75 linear feet long and 18 to 24 inches wide. We started construction on the benchwork in January of 2012, so we're 13 years in. The DCC system is an NCE wireless system, but we use protothrottles to operate the trains. We have two operating crews. The yard crew works the north end of the layout and switches 8 industries here, including the freight house, a cold storage warehouse, a grocery distributor, an oil dealer, and a few others. And the other crew heads to the south end of the layout and switches Nabisco, another cold storage warehouse, and a large food terminal. The layout is really all about switching, and we use switch lists. I generate the switch list really by industry. I use a New York Central Freight Circular from 1963 to identify potential shippers for the customers on my layout. I also use the OBSIG industrial database, which lists customers and shippers in various locations, and between those two documents I've identified a number of shippers for the customers on the layout. So let's go on a tour of Western Manhattan in the mid-1960s. Okay, we're looking at a car float here. It's at the Pier 72 float bridge about 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. And this was prototypical at a time. There was a float bridge on 33rd Street run by the New York Central for the early part of the 20th century. It disappeared later, but I've kept it here, and the trains for our operating session arrived by this car float from Weehawken, New Jersey, which was home to a major New York Central yard. This is Water Street. On this layout, here's where proto-freelancing enters the picture. On Western Manhattan, we'd be looking at West Street or the West Side Highway, depending on the era. But I chose to do Water Street because that's the street I grew up on in Manhattan. And I just like the look of this pier station building and kind of the old cobblestone street running along the river. So after the yard crew unloads the car float and crosses Water Street, it arrives here in 30th Street Yard. On the prototype New York Central, 30th Street Yard was large and probably had close to 100 tracks and different yards for a produce terminal and a brewery and freight houses and so on. But here we have a 33rd Street freight terminal, which is switched during an operating session, and then also tracks in the yard where the operators will place cars that have arrived from Weehawken by car float and get them ready for distribution around the layout. On the New York Central in 30th Street Yard, there were a number of freight houses, which were long, skinny buildings like this one. Here we have just one. During an operating session, it will receive LCL freight from upstate New York, as well as other cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and it's one of the main customers served by the yard crew during an operating session. Terminal Stores Warehouse and Central Stores were both warehouses on the west side of Manhattan. Central Stores was served by the New York Central, and that's the one that's served here by the yard crew on the layout. The Terminal Stores building was a very large block-long building on the west side, and so I've tried to replicate the size of it here, though it's not directly served by rail here. We're looking down 11th Avenue here and also at the Macy's warehouse. Macy's warehouse is not exactly where the prototype was, but Macy's did have a warehouse served by the New York Central in and around 30th Street Yard. The Macy's store itself was closer to Midtown. So this is the Midtown team track. And this is again where proto-freelancing enters the picture. I, of course, like the idea of team tracks because you can really have any rail car served by a team track. But in my case, I've also focused on auto parts and tires for this team track. And as I've looked for shippers, many of them are tire and auto part manufacturers that are sending parts to New York City. This is my representation of Midtown Manhattan. So of course there's a traffic jam and taxi cabs and a police officer and a subway stop. This is a corner of the layout, and when it comes to corners and the tracks have to turn for a corner, I like there to be a reason why the tracks have to turn. So I try to disguise the corners and have some, in this case, buildings present, which the railroad needed to avoid because these are important buildings in Midtown Manhattan. This is Saucony Mobile, and again, this is a proto-freelance part of the layout, and I have a lot of customers that use freight cars and reefers, so this helps me introduce different kinds of cars to the layout. And I like the look of mobile trucks and mobile tank cars, so we've added Saucony Mobile to the layout that is switched by the yard crew. So this is 28th Street, and really just a representation of a busy city street in Manhattan, and it's actually a bridge over the layout. And here I'm just really trying to capture city life on the west side of Manhattan. This is Alvarez Salvage, one of the trashy parts of the layout. And this is also served by the yard crew on the same spur as the Midtown Team Track and Saucony Mobile. And you can see the empty gondola there awaiting a load to be taken back to the yard. This is R.C. Williams and Basanti Produce. R.C. Williams is on the left of the shot. And on the New York Central High Line, R.C. Williams was one of the major customers between 25th and 26th Street. And it was a large international grocery distributor. And here it's a grocery distributor as well. Currently has 3 cars and 1 off spot. And next to R.C. Williams is Basanti Produce. That's a proto-freelance entry into the customers on the layout, and it receives produce from the south and from the west. We're looking down 27th Street, and one thing to note here is the backdrop. All of the backdrops of the streets on this layout are photos taken from the actual High Line. And the High Line in modern days, the old railroad line, is now an elevated park that runs for about 1.5 miles down the west side of Manhattan. And it's actually a very beautiful park, and the history of the railroad is also very present. So we're looking back toward Midtown now along the High Line, and the signal here is the one and only signal on this layout. And to my knowledge, there were no signals at all on the New York Central High Line. But this signal is, during an operating session, switched by me, and it indicates to the crew that's come south out of the yard that they're clear to go back to the yard. This is a collection of industrial buildings that I've set up to run right along the Hudson River, and you can see the tracks in front of the buildings right on the edge of the river. And this represents a change that I made to the layout. A few years ago, this was a double track, and R.C. Williams was in this portion of the layout. And it's not that I didn't like it, but I thought it could be better. And I just really liked the idea of a collection of old industrial buildings. It created kind of a scene block between the two ends of the layout where crews are working. And I've always liked the scene of an urban single track running along a river and old industrial buildings, and that's what influenced this layout. Part of my goal with the layout is to represent city life, and alleys were a part of city life. So here along the edge of the Hudson River is an alley that goes back to a street with some garbage and some trash and a truck and some guys talking, and that would be a typical scene on a back street in the city. We're looking here at an elevated section of the railroad, and the Spear Furniture Warehouse is prototypical. There was a Spear Furniture Warehouse along the High Line. The Towers warehouses, there are a number of Towers warehouses, and this billboard on the side of the building is actually still visible if you walk the High Line. And in the left of the shot is the Merchants Warehouse. In real life, it was the Merchants Refrigerating Company, and it was one of two very large cold storage warehouses along the High Line. And this is Nabisco, the National Biscuit Company, and the New York Central High Line actually did serve Nabisco, and it's one of the major customers on the layout. And I've kind of divided it in half. On the left side with the two Buffalo Creek boxcars is where Nabisco receives flour and occasionally sugar and sometimes boxes. And then on the right side with the jade green New York Central car is Nabisco Shipping. And our operators provide empties for Nabisco to ship its wonderful products. In New York City, on the west side of Manhattan, was the meatpacking district, and Swift and Cudahy and Armour all had facilities there, but I've combined them into one and named it the New York Meat Terminal. But we do have Swift cars and Cudahy cars and Armour cars all coming from the west, mostly around Chicago, Joliet, Illinois, and delivered here to the west side of Manhattan. In the left side of the photo is Washington Street Yard, and that's kind of an off-spot yard. The way I think of operations, the overnight crew delivered some cars here to be delivered to customers down here on the west side, the lower west side of Manhattan. And when we start an operating session, these cars are waiting their turn to be switched, and the operating crew will then take them and deliver them to nearby industries. This is St. John's Park Terminal, and on the prototype, this was the end of the line on the west side of Manhattan, and at one point it was the end of the line on this layout until I expanded. And for a variety of reasons, I just wasn't a fan of how it operated. The track arrangement was a little bit different than it is now, but I decided to leave the building in place in this corner of the layout with an abandoned track, just to help sort of create the city scene. Again, we're in the mid-1960s, and there was a lot of change going on in New York at that time, and a number of old buildings, both industries and old tenement apartment buildings, were either already raised or being raised or were abandoned, and this is kind of a representation of that. So here we're looking at Empire Beverage in the foreground, and that's a proto-freelance customer here. And it receives a variety of beverages, including Coca-Cola products. And in the background we have the Union Freight Terminal, which is a furniture warehouse, and we get furniture from all around the country here to be delivered to Manhattan. Here we're looking at another corner of the layout. This is Pier 17 along the Hudson River, and that actually was a pier used by New York Central. And we have the New York Central covered barges there, which the Central's covered barges and those of other railroads used to be plentiful in New York Harbor into the 1960s. We're kind of at the tail end of that era with the layout, but I liked the looks of them and I wanted them on my waterfront. A little bit closer we have Atlantic Seafood, which is switched by the crew that works this end of the layout. Usually Atlantic Seafood receives empty refrigerator cars to put some fish in that was just delivered by that boat right in front of the covered barge. This is Hudson Cement, again a proto-freelance part of the layout, and gives me the opportunity to introduce some cement hoppers into operation. This kind of cement dealer was often found along waterfront, so I felt like it was a natural fit, even though I don't believe there was one on the west side of Manhattan for the New York Central. We're looking at Austin Nichols, which I've included a rail that went into the building that's no longer in use, so we have an abandoned rail. Austin Nichols was in fact a grocery dealer, but in Brooklyn, not in Manhattan, and it was a very large customer along the East River, and I just needed a nice low building here and something that sort of felt at home in New York City, so I've included it here, and but made it not rail served, but made it formerly rail served. Looking at Baker Williams on the west side of Manhattan for the first more than half of the 20th century, there were at least a half dozen Baker Williams warehouses, so we had to include one here. And now we're at the Riverside Food Terminal, which is the end of the line on my Manhattan Terminal Railroad. And this is representing an operation that was in 30th Street Yard, where there were numerous tracks, far more than the ones I have here, of refrigerator cars and some box cars that delivered produce and food and all kinds of things, and trucks backed in on driveways and pulled right up to the cars, and I needed to represent that here, and it's one of the major switching areas for the operating crew on this end of the layout.